All right, so this morning, I'm going to start us off. I'm going to share with you a little bit more about my family. So this is my lovely sister, Andrea. You might have seen her if you came to my ordination. And we do look very alike. She's 10 years older than me, but she doesn't like me telling everyone that. So, and when we were growing up, we fought like cat and dog. We drove our mum round the bend. And this happened constantly until she moved out in my early teens. And then we started to get on a bit better. And, you know, we have a great relationship now. I love her to bits. But I always thought that our childhood fighting was because of the age gap. But as I've got older, I've realised that we are just so very different. And one of the ways that we are different is around conflict. And I absolutely hate conflict. And arguing, I'm a lover, not a fighter. And looking back, I have probably kept quiet, given in, compromised too much to avoid getting into conflict, which probably wasn't a great thing either. And my sister, on the other hand, I usually describe her as she could start an argument in a room by herself. And I really hope that she doesn't listen to this online, or we probably will have a row. But we all feel differently about things like this because we are all human with our gifts and our flaws. But there's something about conflict in church, which is another family of ours, that can feel deeply uncomfortable. So this morning we continue in Acts, and we've been hearing how the church in Antioch was blessed and encouraged. And it would be nice to think that they never had any problems. But then, of course, that wouldn't be true. So today we're going to hear about division from two unlikely sources, Paul and Barnabas. So let's see what happens.
Sometime later, Paul said to Barnabas, "Let us go back and visit the believers in all the towns where we preach the word of the Lord and see how they are doing." Barnabas wanted to take John, also called Mark, with them. But Paul did not think it wise to take him, because he had deserted them in Pamphylia and had not continued with them in the work. They had such a sharp disagreement that they parted company. Barnabas took Mark and sailed for Cyprus. Paul chose Silas and left. Commended by the believers to the grace of the Lord, he went through Syria and Cilicia, strengthening the churches.
So we learn that Paul and Barnabas planned to go back to the churches in the towns where they had completed their previous missions and church planting work. However, there was an issue. Barnabas wanted to take someone called John Mark, and Paul did not want to take John Mark. Now, here's a few things that might help us understand the situation. First, Paul didn't want to take John Mark because he left their group early in the previous journey. So we learned back in Acts 13. Paul and his companions set sail for Paphos and came to Perga in Pamphylia, but John left them and went back to Jerusalem. And we don't know the circumstances of this, but we just know that he left. And another big factor we learn from the book of Colossians is that Barnabas and John Mark were cousins. So Paul doesn't want to take John Mark, but John Mark is family to Barnabas. So we have a complication at hand, and we have some division starting to rise. And verse 38 says, Paul insisted that they should not take along this man. Paul just wasn't having it. He did not want to take John Mark. Now, generally, Paul seemed to be a very zealous and confident in his position. He was not one to easily compromise. Barnabas, however, was known as the son of encouragement, so perhaps he was a bit more understanding of John Mark's situation. But the two could not agree. Verse 39 says they had such a sharp disagreement that they parted company. And the Greek text uses the word paroxysmos, which means a violent disagreement. And this particular word means a violent, hostile, angry, harsh, sharp, bitter disagreement. And it's hard to believe that this duo we have seen doing such amazing work as we have worked through the book of Acts are now experiencing division. Barnabas was the one who introduced Paul to the apostles and spoke of his genuine conversion. They travelled on multiple journeys together to speak about and defend the gospel. And Barnabas and Paul were the catalysts for the missions work of the church in Antioch. And now these two are experiencing division. But what was remarkable is that the mission continued. Barnabas took John Mark and Paul took Silas. And they leave in opposite directions. They have more men and are ultimately covering more ground. Barnabas and John Mark went by sea to Cyprus, and Paul and Silas went by land back to South Central Asia. But both went for the same reason, to glorify God and exalt Jesus by building up these new churches and continuing to spread the good news. When we disagree with one another, we can trust that ultimately God is still at work. And we can absolutely learn from this today. In churches, like any family, stuff happens. We won't agree on everything. We might not agree on how the Bible is interpreted, how we should live our lives, what we should be doing as a church, how we spend money, who we can help. We might just clash with some people. Churches are full of people, and people can be fickle, sensitive, offensive, confused, selfish, crazy. I'm including myself in all of these, by the way. But people are also wonderfully kind, loving, encouraging, generous, brave, bold, and much more. So we get the blessings of people in church. We also get the challenges of people in church. And here seems a great time to point back to the values series that Matt has been talking about on Sundays for the last 6 weeks. And I really encourage, if you haven't heard these, to listen to them online. We are all wonderfully human with all of our gifts and flaws, but we can aim to be more Jesus-like in the way that we treat others and live our lives. Being humble, kind, open, inclusive, having integrity, and being generous. And we can't guarantee there won't ever be disagreements, but we can treat each other in the best way that we can, the most Jesus-like way that we can. Acts does not tell us that Paul and Barnabas sat down and solved everything immediately. But later on, the New Testament does give us hints that reconciliation likely occurred. One thing we can be sure of is that God is at work in all of our situations. Thankfully, it does not depend on perfect people. In his mercy, he continues to build his church through all of us. his perfectly imperfect people. Amen.